Hello and welcome to another Rabo Food and Agribusiness podcast. My name is Ben Picton. I'm Senior Market Strategist for Rabobank Australia and New Zealand. Today is May the 4th, so may the 4th be with you. And we are very lucky to be joined by my good friend and colleague, Michael Every, who is our Global Strategist based in Singapore. Welcome, Michael.
Great to be here. Thank you for the invite, Ben.
Oh, it's our pleasure to have you. So, Mike, we've had you in Australia for just over a week now. And you've been travelling around with me. We've been up to Brisbane, we've been to Melbourne, and we're back in Sydney today. And you've been talking to our clients about America Perestroika or reverse perestroika. Can you give us a short summary of what is perestroika and how is America doing it in reverse?
Very happy to. First of all, perestroika, it's Russian and it means reconstruction. And for those who remember the 80s, which is a very long time ago for some of us, and before they were born for others. During that period of time, President Gorbachev, who was the last president of the former Soviet Union, was attempting to try and shift a very stagnant, sluggish Soviet economy, which was overly specialized in capital formation, i.e. physically building things, and in military production. He was attempting to try and use perestroika to make it invest less in the wrong areas and to produce more consumer products and less military ones. So that's what he tried to do. What I argue Trump is trying to do now, as the president of the US today, is a reverse perestroika in that in all kinds of ways, he is trying to increase capital investment in a US system which structurally doesn't invest enough, and shift what it does produce away from consumer goods and consumption towards the military and industry.
So the Soviet Union was a capital-intensive economy, but it didn't produce any consumer goods. And what I'm hearing is that the United States is effectively like a mirror image. So it's really good at consumption, but maybe not doing enough on the investment and production side. Is that a fair summary?
Correct. I mean, I introduced that very slowly because I was talking myself through it step by step, and now I'll accelerate my pace of speaking just slightly.
Lovely.
Yes, when you look at it, you can see that the US effectively, it's now the global hegemon, the great superpower. And the USSR was a superpower in its own right, but it used to invest 25% of GDP in defense. The US today, even if it passes the new mega Pentagon budget, which is talking about introducing, is only going to be spending about 4.8%, say round up to 5. So it's a fraction of what the Soviets were doing, but they can't get by with 2 or with 3 anymore. And as they increase that spending, they need to have an economy which can actually supply the goods that they're going to be spending the money on, which means you do need a trade-off away from consumption back towards investment and back towards that military-industrial complex.
Okay. So economics is all about choices, and now we're maybe potentially looking at some different choices ahead. So you said that maybe they can't do 2 to 3% of GDP on defense anymore, and they're looking to do 4.8. Why? Why these attempts to restructure the American economic model? Is there some sort of external force that is making this necessary?
Well, there is. It starts with C and it rhymes with Dinah, in that effectively the Americans are looking around and realizing that the past 45 years of globalization have effectively created an America that consumes while China produces. And if you look at a key statistic, for example, how many naval vessels China can produce compared to the Americans, it's something like 250 to 1. Now, not all of them are big, but even the really, really big juicy ones like aircraft carriers, China can happily pump out an aircraft carrier a year. It takes the US about 5 or 6 years to build one. And some of them are actually getting quite old. So if you project forward, and it's very, very easy spreadsheet maths, you can see within 10 years, stretch it to 15 if you're an optimist, but let's say 10, China could have more aircraft carriers than the US. And once you start seeing that dynamic, the power dynamic globally starts to shift with it, because China can then project power wherever it wants to. And the US is on a declining trajectory relative to China's.
Right. So this is why we have the urgency suddenly to restructure the economic model and shift the onus back towards production rather than consumption. Is this also the reason why we see America being a little bit sort of sharp-elbowed with allies and trying to push allies around and get them to do what the Americans would like?
Well, that's the key reason in my view. Effectively, it's not just purely about that defense spend, which is a huge part of it. It's about a more general restructuring of as much of the economy as possible in order to create that outcome. So let's unpack that just for 30 seconds. America obviously is introducing tariffs. Lots of people pull their hair out, tariffs, tariffs, tariffs. How do you reindustrialize without tariffs? If China can produce cheaper than you on everything, are you supposed to just smile and say, well, thank you, free trade, which means that you don't produce the inputs that you put into the weapons, which you're going to be at some point, sailing up and down in rivalry to China? That makes no sense whatsoever unless you are a flat earth utopian economist, or, somebody who just says because markets 10 times before breakfast every day. In the real world, that just does not float, doesn't fly, doesn't hunt. And as a result, they will have to introduce tariffs to try to create that nexus of production back in the States.
Okay, so we're already seeing tariffs, various announcements of tariffs, particularly on Liberation Day last year. We've seen a Supreme Court decision overturning some of those tariffs, but tariffs have been implemented using other mechanisms in the United States. What about other countries? Are you seeing signs of this shift starting to happen in other countries, particularly Western countries? Are there signs emerging of others getting on board with this?
Where aren't there? That's the better way to put it. Not only is America doing what I predicted years ago it would do, which is to bring in extensive tariffs in order to reindustrialize, other countries, equally as predictably, are then saying, well, we hate that, oh, we're going to do the same, which really gives pay to the lie that this is actually something that people don't like doing, because as soon as they see someone else doing it, rather than saying, I will thoroughly reject that because it's an economic and political nonsense, they say, yeah, I'll do it too. Because if you're going to increase production domestically, well, I want to protect my industry domestically, which is the whole point why America is doing it in the first place. So Europe is starting to increase tariffs. The UK is. Even Australia has in some sectors. But it's absolutely global. Wherever you look, you see countries, big or small, starting to protect key sectors. And of course, you don't have to do it just with tariffs. There are other ways you can do it. You can subsidize the hell out of your firms. That will work exactly the same way. And I can tell you some countries do that. And I've even seen a headline just in the past 48 hours. Colombia and Ecuador are seeing trade absolutely collapse between the two of them because Ecuador has piled on the tariffs against Colombian production. So it's happening everywhere you look.
Yeah, and I know that particularly for some local context here in Australia, we've had lots of legacy industry bailouts recently. Aluminium smelters, lead smelters, zinc smelters, copper smelters, steel mill down in Whyalla in South Australia, and lots of below cost of capital loans being extended for strategic industry. So all of that kind of feeds into this trend, doesn't it? That all of that is a variety of protectionism, maybe not exactly the same as what we're seeing in the United States, but just a different flavour of the same ice cream, I guess.
It is. It's a different flavour of the same ice cream, and it's aimed at filling that same rumbling stomach, which is to say, are we going to be able to produce what we think we might need in a pinch? Because it's about resilience and it's about national security, those two magic words. You say that and markets go out the window.
Okay, so we care about resilience, we care about supply chains, we care about national security, and we've got a big wake-up call on all of these things recently with the Hormuz crisis and the shortage of physical items that we need for 21st century life. We also had that with the war in Ukraine. The Europeans felt that one most acutely. And before that, with the COVID-19 pandemic, when we figured out that we didn't know how to make personal protective equipment or respirators or medications. So we see this shift, and it's kind of being driven out of the United States. But what happens if Donald Trump loses the upcoming midterm elections in November later this year, or even if he loses the Republicans lose the presidency in 2028? Does this shift keep on happening? Does it look a little bit different? Or is it all just a bad dream, and do we go back to how things were before?
Well, that's not going to happen for sure, but everything else is up in the air. First of all, on that election, without getting in front of my skis and talking about other economies too much, no one knows what's going to happen in the midterms. The polling is very clear at the moment, but we've absolutely just been thrown a curveball by the fact that the Supreme Court has upended the legislation which dictates where you draw the boundary lines between constituencies. And we're likely to see, the redrawing of them right the way across the US, very much to the favor of the Republicans. So it's possible that Trump can squeak a win even with bad opinion polls on the back of that. It's not a given, but it's possible. But were we to see Trump defeated in the midterms, I think he's more likely to double down via executive order, even if he can't manage to do things via legislation. That's largely what he's leaning on at the moment anyway. And if the Republicans were to be defeated in 2028, once you get a Democrat coming in, they will confront exactly the same set of problems that the Republicans are. So what's their strategy going to be? It depends who wins as a Democrat, but there's a strong possibility you might have a complete isolationist. If you're an isolationist, you're not really a free trader either. The most positive possible outcome for Australia's perspective might be, Australia and New Zealand, might be if it's a Democrat that decides to be a bit more Biden-esque and say, well, let's hug our allies a bit more. Fine, but it doesn't solve any of the problems that America has been facing with allies who allow Chinese goods to come in and then sell them onto America, or who don't try and build up their own industries to stand alongside America in what it sees as this upcoming struggle. So to cut a long story short, no one knows what will happen, but the one thing I'm almost certain won't happen is a nice retreat back to the way things were, singing Kumbaya and toasting marshmallows around the fire.
Okay, so this is the direction of travel, whatever happens, and maybe the best we can hope for is an America that's a little bit more assertive, pushing allies to do the hard, uncomfortable thing that we don't want to do. And maybe the worst is actually America becoming more isolationist and rolling back the frontier. I see today there's stories about America pulling 5,000 troops out of Germany. Could we potentially expect more headlines like that in the months ahead?
Well, I don't know about the months ahead, because that's very hard to call. And certainly there will be legislative hurdles to overcome. I believe there's actually a hard floor on NATO troops in Europe of 76,000, and it takes Congress to actually get around that. But certainly there can be a reshuffling. Trump can send troops from Germany to Poland, for example. He's also spoken about pulling them out of Italy and Spain. So there can be a carrot and a stick. It would certainly be a hell of a shock for Australia and New Zealand in particular, were we at some point to see a more isolationist president than Trump. And trust me, you can be much more isolationist than Trump if you look at American history, saying not only are we not going to fight wars like the one in Iran anymore, we're just not going to be protecting anybody anymore. We're just going to go home. And I mean, that makes people's hair stand up on the back of their neck. But that possibility can no longer be discounted the further out you look.
So is isolationism, is that what we should expect if Donald Trump is not successful with these reverse perestroika attempts to reform the US economy, or should we expect something else?
Well, it's not a given, because it can be a spectrum from a continuation of Trumpism to, by another name, to a milquetoast or weaker version of Trumpism which moves in the same direction, to a radical pivot to isolationism. We're not quite sure what it could be, but that spectrum is deeply, deeply, deeply unsettling. And so every country, including Australia and New Zealand, obviously have to start thinking about resilience much more. Resilience, resilience, resilience. Because if you don't think that way, the opposite really is fragility, fragility, fragility.
Yeah, this is interesting because in the Australian context here, we have an inflation problem in the here and now, and we have rising interest rates. And as we look at some of these trends that we're starting to see, the breakdown of liberalised, globalised trading systems, increasing protectionism, more of a focus on security rather than efficiency. We see all of these headwinds in the supply side of the economy. And when I look at something like a long-term graph of the 10-year government bond yield in Australia, suddenly we've broken out of a 40-year downward trend in interest rates, and it looks like now the trend is up. And that looks an awful lot like the 1960s and 70s when the international environment much more closely resembled what we're seeing today. So is there some potential that given these big paradigmatic changes that we're seeing a more supply-constrained supply side of the economy, and could it be higher for longer in terms of interest rates?
Well, you make the RBA call, not me, Ben. So you can give me the direct answer on what you expect to see. But if you're looking structurally, yes. And I've made an argument for years, which I know you're aware of and maybe listeners aren't, which is we were in an environment of lower for longer for a very long time. And there was no one more passionate an advocate of that than myself. But I said at some point, geopolitically, something will snap. And when something either politically, i.e., a populist movement takes over the country that wants to try and genuinely reflate behind tariff barriers, if that happens politically and or geopolitically, we start to get countries, creating friction between each other, or even, creating flames, as we saw between Russia and Ukraine, because of a fight over borders and resources, etc., etc. that combination of the two of them will actually see a massive inflation impulse coming through, both from the supply side, because there's a constriction of supply, and on the demand side, because rearming is really, really historically expensive. And there's a whole generation working in bond markets who don't understand just how expensive and distorting it is. So I've been making that argument for a long time, and I look around me and I look at the charts you're referring to, and I see, yes, this is exactly what you would expect to look at in that kind of circumstance.
Very interesting. Well, I guess maybe just for a little bit of a silver lining here, this is not new. In many ways, this is actually the norm. If we look back historically, really free trade has only happened since the 1980s onwards. And before that, we only really had one period of free trade in the history of Australia and New Zealand, and that was immediately prior to World War I. So for most of our history, protectionism, high levels of tariff protection, subsidies, state involvement in the economy is actually the norm. So maybe we're pivoting back to a model that is actually more historically normal, and we shouldn't be as fearful of that as maybe some of the uncertainty suggests. But I'm looking for another positive here, Mike. One of the things that you've spoken a lot about recently is the need to control physical supply chains. You need to have physical supply of stuff. Here in New Zealand and Australia, we're surplus producers of food, and in Australia's case, also minerals and energy. Are there potentially some big opportunities in those spaces under this new international environment that we're looking at?
Well, absolutely. If you're in a world which is supply constrained, which is short of stuff, and you have stuff, it's a pretty sweet spot to be in. The problem is, if you have stuff and everybody wants stuff and you can't defend yourself, it's a pretty awful place to be in. So the long and the short of it is this, that all the upside should be obvious, and absolutely rub your hands because it is. The downside is you have to make sure you're going to be part of a network where you can be 100% sure that regardless of what happens, you have that resilience that we were talking about. And I don't think that's something Australia can do alone. I don't think it's something New Zealand can do alone. I think it's something they can do well together, or better together. And I think it's something both of them will do in collaboration with others. Now, what that will look like in geopolitical terms is those countries' choices. And I'm not here to tell anyone what they should or shouldn't do. But I suspect you will see the same dynamic down here that you're seeing elsewhere, which is to see a consolidation. So at the same time as forces are pulling us apart, forces are also pushing us together. And I think what that new emerging architecture looks like is starting to become clearer to those who want to join those dots. And within that architecture, there are going to be vast opportunities. Where the risks will come from will be those who do nothing and just presume that we're going to remain in the status quo ante, which is just not true, or who do not read the runes correctly and don't understand that the tectonic plates are shifting. And if you have 1 foot on one and 1 foot on another, it's going to get pretty painful as they drift apart.
Okay, well, fascinating. We might wrap it up there, Mike, but thank you as always for your time. It's been a great pleasure to talk with you today, and really nice to have you here in Australia and have the opportunity to travel around with you and speak to our clients about some of these really big themes. So this has been another Rabo Food and Agribusiness podcast. To all of our listeners out there, thank you very much, and I'll remind you to share the podcast with your friends, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever it is that you get your podcasts. We also have lots of other podcasts, so we encourage you to search through and look those up. And you can also read our regular published reports on the Rabobank Knowledge website. So my name is Ben Picton. Thank you very much for joining us.